A quiet day in the park. James Robinson adjusted his wide-brimmed hat as he leaned back on the bench in Central Oak Park. The summer sun filtered through the dense canopy of trees, casting dappled patterns on the ground. At 70, James still had a commanding presence. Broad-shouldered and standing just over 6 feet tall, his posture was as upright as ever, his demeanor calm but watchful. Decades in the U.S. Army had shaped him into a man of discipline and resilience. Now retired, James enjoyed the simplicity of mornings like this, watching children laugh on the swings, joggers loop the trail, and squirrels dart between the bushes. Despite the serenity of the park, James felt an ever-present undercurrent of tension in the air. He had seen too much of the world to believe that peace could ever be taken for granted. His military service had taught him that vigilance was not paranoia. It was survival. James reached for the hardcover novel resting on the bench beside him, one of his favorites about leadership and courage. He had barely turned the page when a disturbance drew his attention. 2 uniformed police officers entered the park from the main gate, their eyes scanning the area like hawks. The older officer, a stocky man with a sun-reddened face, walked with an air of authority, his hand resting casually on the holster of his firearm. The younger officer, a lean, nervous-looking man, followed a step behind, his eyes flickering from side to side. Their presence didn't bother James, at least not initially. Parks were common places for patrols, and he had no reason to expect trouble. Yet as the 2 officers made their way through the park, James noticed the older one's gaze lock onto him. The officer's stride quickened, his partner struggling to keep up. "Hey, you," the older officer barked, his voice cutting through the peaceful atmosphere like a whip. James looked up, confused but calm. The officer was staring directly at him. "Yes?" James asked, keeping his tone neutral. "This isn't a homeless shelter," the officer snapped, gesturing around the park. "Move along." James blinked, momentarily taken aback. "I'm sorry. Are you talking to me?" "Don't play games," the officer said, stepping closer. "We've had complaints about vagrants hanging around here. Time to pack it up." "I'm just sitting here enjoying the park," James replied evenly, though his heartbeat began to quicken. He could feel the weight of the officer's suspicion pressing down on him. "I haven't done anything wrong." The younger officer hesitated, glancing nervously between his partner and James. "Sarge, maybe we should." "Quiet, Miller," the older officer growled. He turned back to James, his hand inching closer to his holster. "Let's see some ID." James frowned but reached for his wallet. "May I ask why I'm being asked to show identification?" The sergeant's face darkened, and his posture stiffened. "Because I said so." "Are you refusing to cooperate?" "I didn't say that," James replied, his voice steady but firm. "I just want to understand why I'm being singled out." "It's because you match the description," the sergeant snapped. "The description of what?" James asked, his voice rising slightly despite his attempt to remain calm. "A man sitting quietly on a park bench." The question hung in the air, and for a moment, neither officer responded. The younger one, Miller, shifted uncomfortably, while the sergeant's jaw tightened. "Last chance," the sergeant growled. "ID now, or you're coming with us." Suppressing a sigh, James slowly pulled his wallet from his pocket. But as he withdrew his military identification, a gust of wind snatched it from his fingers. The card fluttered to the ground a few feet away. Instinctively, James started to rise to retrieve it. "Don't move," the sergeant barked, his hand now fully gripping his holstered weapon. James froze, his hands instinctively raised to shoulder height. "I'm just picking up my ID," he said evenly. "You heard him. Don't move," the sergeant said, stepping forward. Without warning, he grabbed James's arm and twisted it behind his back with a force that made James wince. "You're under arrest for resisting an officer," the sergeant declared, reaching for his cuffs. "This is absurd," James protested, the pain in his shoulder intensifying. My ID is right there on the ground. I'm a retired U.S. Army general, not some vagrant. Miller hesitated, his eyes darting to the ID card lying on the grass. Sarge, he said softly, maybe we should check his ID first. I said quiet. The sergeant barked, yanking James's arm harder. By now, a small crowd had begun to gather, their murmurs growing louder. Some had their phones out, recording the encounter. "Excuse me," a voice rang out, firm and commanding. All heads turned to see a tall man in a dark blue police captain's uniform striding towards the scene. His sharp features and piercing gaze exuded authority, and his tone left no room for argument. "What the hell is going on here?" the captain demanded. The sergeant's grip on James slackened as he turned to face the newcomer. "Captain Jackson, we received a complaint about vagrants." "Let him go," Jackson ordered, his voice like steel. The sergeant hesitated, but the weight of the captain's gaze left no room for defiance. He released James, who rubbed his sore arm as he stepped back. Jackson bent down to retrieve the fallen ID card. His eyes widened as he read the name and rank. "General James Robinson," he asked, his tone shifting to one of disbelief and respect. James nodded, still catching his breath. "That's correct." "It's an honor to meet you, sir," Jackson said, standing to face him. "I've read about your service in the Gulf War. I can't believe this happened." "Believe it," James said, his tone clipped but measured. He gestured towards the sergeant. "I was sitting here reading a book when I was accused of being a vagrant and treated like a criminal." Jackson's jaw tightened as he turned to the sergeant. "Howard, we'll discuss this back at the station. For now, you're done here." "But, Captain," Howard began. "Now," Jackson snapped, his voice brooking no argument. As the sergeant stalked off, Jackson turned back to James, his expression apologetic. "General, I deeply regret this incident. It shouldn't have happened." James nodded but remained guarded. "Captain, I appreciate your intervention, but this goes far beyond one bad interaction. This is a systemic problem." Jackson's expression grew somber. "I know, and I'd like to discuss how we can address it. But for now, let's get you some ice for that arm." As James followed Jackson towards a nearby patrol car, he glanced back at the crowd. Their faces were a mixture of anger, confusion, and concern. Among them was a young woman holding up her phone. She caught James's eye and mouthed, "I got it all." James nodded subtly. The moment might have been humiliating, but it wasn't the end. It was the beginning, unveiling the spark of change. Later that afternoon, James sat at his kitchen table, a bag of ice pressed against his shoulder. His home, a modest two-story house adorned with military memorabilia, was a sanctuary, a place where he had always felt safe and respected. But today, that sense of security felt fragile. The events of the morning replayed in his mind like a broken record. The sergeant's hostility, the snap judgment, the cold steel of the cuffs. It wasn't the first time James had experienced prejudice, but it was the first time it had struck so deeply in his retirement. His phone buzzed on the table, breaking his reverie. He glanced at the screen to see an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "General Robinson speaking," he said, his voice steady but weary. "General, this is Sarah Chen. I was the woman at the park who recorded the incident earlier. Do you remember me?" James smiled faintly. "Yes, Sarah. Thank you for stepping forward. That recording could be important." "About that," Sarah said, her voice tinged with urgency. "The video's gone viral. It's all over social media, and people are demanding answers. News outlets are picking it up too. I thought you should know." James sat back in his chair, absorbing her words. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough," Sarah replied. "The comments are a mix of outrage and support. People are furious about what happened, but some are already spinning it to fit their own narratives. There's a lot of noise." James sighed deeply. "And you? How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," Sarah said, though her voice betrayed her unease. I couldn't stay silent, sir. What happened wasn't right, and people need to see it. You did the right thing, James assured her. But now we need to make sure this momentum leads to something meaningful. Sarah hesitated. What do you need from me? James straightened in his chair. Meet me tomorrow at the Veterans Center downtown. Bring a copy of the video. If this is gaining traction, we need to channel it into action. I'll be there, Sarah said firmly. And General, yes. Thank you for standing your ground today. It means a lot. James hung up the phone, his mind racing. He stood and walked to his study, where shelves of military awards and photographs lined the walls. One particular photo caught his eye. A younger version of himself in full dress uniform, shaking hands with a fellow officer. The caption read, "Leadership is earned through trust, not power." He ran a hand over the frame, the words resonating deeply. Trust, he thought. That's what had been shattered today, not just between him and those officers, but between law enforcement and the community at large. And trust, once broken, was not easily rebuilt. The next morning, James arrived at the Veterans Center, a small but bustling building on the east side of town. The center was a haven for retired service members, a place where they could find camaraderie and support. James had been volunteering there since his retirement, mentoring younger veterans and helping them navigate civilian life. Sarah was already waiting in the lobby, clutching a tablet and a notepad. She looked nervous but determined. "Good morning, General," she greeted him. "Call me James," he said with a smile. "No need for formalities here." She nodded, her grip on the tablet tightening. "I brought the video and some of the comments from social media. People are already organizing protests." James frowned. Protests can be a double-edged sword. They're powerful tools, but they can also escalate quickly if not managed properly. We need to be careful. Sarah followed him into a small conference room, where James had set up a whiteboard and a projector. He motioned for her to sit as he connected her tablet to the projector. The video played on the screen, its clarity stark and unflinching. The sergeant's harsh words, the physical aggression, the crowd's growing unrest, it was all there, raw and undeniable. As the video ended, James turned to Sarah. "This is powerful," he said. "It's a window into a systemic issue, but it's also a rallying cry. People are angry, and rightfully so. But anger alone isn't enough. We need a plan." Sarah tilted her head. "What kind of plan?" "Change," James said simply. "Not just at the surface level, but deeper. Real, systemic change." He picked up a marker and began writing on the whiteboard. "Engage the community. Demand accountability. Foster dialogue between police and citizens. Push for policy reform." Sarah nodded as she read the list. "How do we even start?" James tapped the first point. "We start by listening. People are angry, but they're also hurting. We need to hear their stories, their experiences, and we need to amplify their voices." Later that day, James and Sarah attended a hastily organized community meeting at a local church. The room was packed, the air thick with tension. Many of the attendees had seen the viral video, and their emotions were running high. James stepped to the front of the room, his military posture commanding attention. He held up his hands for silence. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady. "My name is James Robinson. Some of you may know me as the man in the video. I'm also a retired U.S. Army general and a lifelong advocate for justice and fairness. What happened yesterday wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger problem. And that problem affects all of us." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but James pressed on. "I'm not here to point fingers or stoke anger. I'm here because I believe we can do better. But to do that, we need to work together. We need to identify the root causes of these issues and address them head-on." A hand shot up in the crowd. A middle-aged woman with a fiery expression stood. "With all due respect, General, we've heard this before. People talk about change, but nothing ever happens. How do we know this time will be different? James met her gaze, his expression resolute. Because I'm not just here to talk. I'm here to act. And I need all of you to hold me accountable. If we want change, we have to demand it. And we have to work for it. The woman nodded slowly and sat down. James glanced at Sarah, who gave him an encouraging smile. He continued speaking, outlining his plan to foster dialogue between the community and law enforcement, to advocate for stricter oversight, and to push for reforms that prioritized de-escalation and accountability. By the end of the meeting, the crowd was buzzing with a mix of hope and skepticism. As James and Sarah made their way to the exit, a young man stopped them. He was wearing a hoodie and sneakers, his expression guarded. "General," he said hesitantly, "I was there yesterday. I saw what happened. If you're serious about making change, I want to help." James extended his hand. "What's your name, son?" "Marcus," the young man replied, shaking his hand. "Marcus Taylor." "Welcome aboard, Marcus," James said with a faint smile. "Let's get to work." As the evening wore on, James sat alone in his study, reflecting on the day's events. The road ahead was daunting, but he felt a spark of hope. People were listening. People were ready, and he was determined to lead them toward a brighter future. With a deep breath, he turned off the light and prepared for the challenges that tomorrow would bring. The bridge to action. The morning after the community meeting, James sat at his dining table with a mug of black coffee in hand, staring at a neatly folded newspaper. The front page headline read, "Veteran General Confronts Systemic Injustice, a Community at a Crossroads." Beneath the bold letters was a still frame from the viral video, capturing the exact moment the sergeant had twisted James's arm behind his back. He set the paper aside, his jaw tightening. Public attention was growing, but the real work lay ahead. Words on paper didn't solve problems. Action did. And if there was one thing James had learned in his military career, it was how to lead under pressure. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone buzzing on the table. The screen lit up with a name he recognized, Captain Marcus Jackson. "Good morning, Captain," James said as he answered. "Morning, General. I hope I'm not catching you too early." "Not at all. What's on your mind?" Jackson's tone was serious. "There's been some backlash within the department. The union's already pushing back against the idea of reform, and a few officers are calling it a witch hunt. I thought you should know." James exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. "That's to be expected. Resistance to change is a natural part of the process, especially in systems that have been entrenched for so long." Jackson hesitated. "I don't think this is just resistance. I've heard whispers, officers planning to boycott community meetings, some even threatening to resign." "Let them resign," James said firmly. "If they're unwilling to adapt to a system that prioritizes justice and accountability, then they're not suited for the job." Jackson's voice lowered. "It's not that simple, General. The department is already understaffed, and losing more officers could create gaps that put the community at risk." James's eyes narrowed. "Then we need to focus on building bridges, Captain. The community is willing to work with us, but we need officers who are willing to listen and learn." Jackson was silent for a moment. Finally, he said, "There's a meeting scheduled this afternoon at City Hall with the mayor, community leaders, and the union reps. I think you should be there." James leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "I'll be there. And Captain." "Yes. Stay strong. This isn't just about us. It's about the future of our community." The meeting at City Hall. The council chamber at City Hall was packed to capacity. A long rectangular table dominated the room, surrounded by city officials, police union representatives, community leaders, and activists. Onlookers filled the gallery, their expressions ranging from hope to skepticism. James entered the chamber, his towering frame and composed demeanor immediately commanding attention. Sarah and Marcus had joined him, their presence a quiet but powerful statement of unity. The mayor, Frank Delgado, stood at the head of the table. A wiry man in his late 50s, Delgado's expression was pinched, his eyes scanning the room nervously. Beside him sat Captain Jackson, who offered James a subtle nod as he took his seat. The meeting began with formalities and opening statements, each party taking turns to address the incident in the park and the broader issues it had brought to light. When it was James's turn to speak, the room fell silent. "Good afternoon," James began, his voice steady and resonant. "Let me start by saying this. I am not here to vilify law enforcement. I have the utmost respect for those who put their lives on the line to serve and protect. But respect and accountability are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they must go hand in hand." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "What happened to me in the park was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger problem, one that won't be solved by platitudes or surface-level fixes. We need systemic change. And that starts with us, right here in this room." As James outlined his proposals, enhanced de-escalation training, community oversight, and strict accountability measures, he could feel the tension in the room shift. Some nodded in agreement, while others crossed their arms or muttered under their breath. When he finished, the union representative, a burly man named Officer Grant, leaned forward in his chair, his expression skeptical. "With all due respect, General, it's easy to talk about reform when you're not the one out there risking your life every day. You're asking us to tie our hands behind our backs while criminals run free." James met his gaze unflinchingly. "Officer Grant, I understand your concerns, but reform isn't about tying anyone's hands. It's about ensuring that the power you wield is used responsibly and fairly. Accountability doesn't weaken law enforcement. It strengthens it by building trust with the community." Grant snorted. "And what happens when an officer hesitates because they're afraid of being crucified in the media? What happens when that hesitation costs lives?" "That's why proper training is critical," James replied. "Hesitation comes from uncertainty. With the right tools and knowledge, officers can make split-second decisions with confidence and clarity. This isn't about creating fear. It's about empowering you to do your job better." The room buzzed with murmurs as Grant leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Breaking through resistance. As the meeting progressed, tensions ebbed and flowed. Some officers voiced support for reform, while others doubled down on their resistance. James listened carefully, addressing concerns with patience and precision. Sarah and Marcus occasionally chimed in, sharing their perspectives as community members. By the end of the meeting, an uneasy truce seemed to have been reached. The mayor summarized the key points of agreement, including a commitment to pilot the proposed reforms over the next 6 months. As the attendees began to file out, Grant approached James. "General," he said gruffly, "I still don't agree with everything you're pushing for, but you've got guts. I'll give you that." James extended his hand. "Thank you, Officer Grant. I hope we can find common ground as we move forward." Grant hesitated before shaking his hand. "We'll see." A community united. That evening, James, Sarah, and Marcus returned to the Veterans Center to debrief. They were joined by a small group of community leaders and activists who had attended the meeting. "That was intense," Sarah said, sinking into a chair, "but I think we made progress." "We did," James agreed. "But the real work starts now. We need to ensure these reforms are implemented effectively and that the community stays engaged." Marcus leaned forward, his expression earnest. "What can we do to help?" "Spread the word," James said. "Organize town halls, encourage people to share their stories, and keep the pressure on the city to follow through. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with persistence." As the group strategized late into the night, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but he was ready to face them head-on. This was no longer just about what had happened in the park. It was about building a better future for everyone, and James Robinson was determined to lead the way. Voices of a fractured community. The days following the City Hall meeting were a whirlwind of activity. James Robinson, Sarah Chen, and Marcus Taylor worked tirelessly to bring the community together. They organized forums, knocked on doors, and reached out to local leaders, all while keeping a close eye on the police department's response to the initial reforms. But the true test came during a town hall meeting at the old Miller Civic Center, a space with peeling paint and flickering lights that spoke of the city's struggles. It was a fitting backdrop for the conversations that needed to take place. Flyers had gone out across the city, promising a forum where everyone's voice would be heard. By the time James arrived, the center was packed with people. The seats were filled, the aisles crowded, and the walls lined with those who couldn't find a place to sit. The air was thick with tension, the hum of whispered conversations, underscored by the occasional outburst of frustration. Some people carried signs demanding justice, while others wore expressions of guarded skepticism. James stood at the back of the room, taking in the scene. Sarah and Marcus approached him, their faces a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. "It's a full house," Sarah said, glancing around. "And judging by the energy in here, it's not going to be an easy crowd." "That's good," James replied, his voice calm. "The harder the conversation, the more necessary it is. Let's get started." The gathering storm. James stepped onto the makeshift stage, a simple wooden platform with a microphone perched on a flimsy stand. The murmurs in the crowd died down as his tall figure commanded attention. He scanned the room, meeting the eyes of as many people as he could. This wasn't a military briefing. This was something far more delicate. "Good evening," James began, his voice resonant. "Thank you for being here tonight. My name is James Robinson. Many of you know me as the man in the video, but I'm here today as a member of this community, just like you." A ripple of murmurs ran through the crowd, but James pressed on. "I know you're angry," he continued. "I am too. What happened to me in the park was unjust, but what's more troubling is that it's not unique. Many of you have experienced or witnessed similar injustices. That's why we're here, to talk, to listen, and to figure out how we can move forward." A hand shot up in the front row. It belonged to an older woman with gray-streaked hair and a piercing gaze. "Move forward. You think we can just move forward after everything we've been through?" James nodded, stepping closer to the edge of the stage. "No, ma'am. Moving forward doesn't mean forgetting or ignoring the past. It means addressing it head-on, learning from it, and ensuring it doesn't happen again. But we can't do that without your input." The woman folded her arms, her expression still wary, but she sat back in her chair. James glanced at Sarah, who gave him a small nod before stepping to the microphone. "We've set up a few ground rules for tonight," she said. "First, everyone will have a chance to speak, but we ask that you keep your comments to 2 minutes so we can hear from as many people as possible. Second, let's keep it respectful. This is a safe space, and we're all here to find solutions." She gestured toward Marcus, who handed her a wireless microphone. "Who wants to go first?" The stories unfold. One by one, people stood to speak. A young black man in his 20s recounted how he had been stopped and frisked while walking home from work, accused of fitting the description. An older Latino man shared a story of his teenage son being harassed by officers outside a convenience store. A middle-aged white woman spoke tearfully about how her brother, a police officer, had been ostracized by his colleagues for speaking out against misconduct. The stories came in waves, each one adding to the collective weight of the room. James listened intently, his face a mask of calm even as his heart ached. These weren't just anecdotes. They were the raw, unfiltered realities of a broken system. As the evening wore on, the crowd grew restless. Voices overlapped, emotions flared, and the line between dialogue and argument began to blur. A heated exchange erupted between a group of activists and a cluster of off-duty officers who had come to defend their profession. "You don't know what it's like out there," one officer shouted. "We risk our lives every day, and all you do is criticize us. And what about the lives you ruin?" An activist shot back. What about the people who never make it home because of your so-called split-second decisions? James stepped forward, raising his hand for silence. The room quieted, but the tension was palpable. I understand both sides, he said, his voice firm but measured. Officers, you're right. Your job is dangerous, and it requires decisions most of us can't imagine making. But that doesn't excuse the misuse of power or the harm caused by bias. And to the community members, your pain and anger are valid, but we must channel them into solutions, not division. We're here to bridge the gap, not widen it. A glimmer of hope. The meeting continued into the night, with more stories, more questions, and more tension. But as the hours passed, something began to shift. The anger in the room didn't dissipate, but it began to take on a new form, one laced with determination and purpose. Toward the end of the evening, a young black woman named Aisha took the microphone. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed the weight of her emotions. I've lived in this city my whole life, she began. I've seen friends harassed, family members incarcerated, and communities torn apart. I've also seen people like you, General Robinson, who are willing to stand up and say, enough is enough. But I need to know, what's next? What are we actually going to do? The room fell silent, all eyes on James. He stepped forward, his expression resolute. Aisha, you're right to ask that question. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen with words alone. But here's what we're going to do. He outlined a series of immediate actions, creating a civilian oversight board, implementing mandatory de-escalation training for officers, and establishing regular community forums to maintain open lines of communication. He also announced a plan to launch a mentorship program, pairing police officers with community members to foster mutual understanding. These are just the first steps, James said, but they're steps we can take together. This isn't about one side against another. It's about all of us working toward a safer, fairer city. The room erupted into applause, but it wasn't unanimous. Some clapped enthusiastically, while others sat silently, their skepticism evident. James didn't mind. Progress wasn't about pleasing everyone. It was about doing what was right. A new beginning. As the meeting ended and the crowd began to disperse, James lingered near the exit, shaking hands and listening to last-minute comments. Aisha approached him, her expression still serious. I'm holding you to this, General, she said. No excuses, no backtracking. You have my word, James replied. And if I fall short, I expect you to call me out. Aisha's lips curved into a small smile. Don't worry, I will. As James walked out into the cool night air, Sarah and Marcus joined him, their faces lit with a mixture of exhaustion and hope. That was intense, Marcus said, but I think we made progress. We did, James agreed, but this is just the beginning. The real work starts tomorrow. And as they walked into the night, James felt a flicker of hope burning brighter than it had in years. This wasn't just about fixing a system. It was about rebuilding trust, healing wounds, and creating a future where no one was left behind. And for the first time in a long time, he believed it was possible. The fight for accountability. The morning sun streamed through the windows of James Robinson's modest study, illuminating the medals and framed photographs that lined the walls. Despite the warmth of the room, the general felt a chill as he reviewed the draft proposal for the Civilian Oversight Board. The reforms he had promised during the town hall meeting were taking shape, but they were already meeting resistance. His phone buzzed beside him. He glanced at the screen and saw Captain Marcus Jackson's name. Answering the call, he immediately sensed the tension in Jackson's voice. General, we've got a problem, Jackson began without preamble. The union's leadership is doubling down. They're calling the Oversight Board unconstitutional and a threat to officer safety. They're pushing for a vote of no confidence against me. James leaned back in his chair, his mind already calculating. How widespread is the dissent? Hard to say, Jackson admitted. But it's gaining traction. We've had a handful of officers resign, and morale is shaky. James closed his eyes for a moment, grounding himself. Captain, this was never going to be easy. Systems don't change without resistance, but you're not alone in this fight. Jackson sighed audibly. I appreciate that, General. But I need something concrete to rally my officers, a reason to believe this is worth it. James nodded, even though Jackson couldn't see him. We'll give them a reason. Meet me at the Veterans Center this afternoon. Bring any officers who are on the fence. Understood, Jackson replied. See you there. A divided precinct. That afternoon, James stood in the Veterans Center conference room, a space he had transformed into an impromptu war room. A whiteboard was covered with bullet points detailing proposed reforms, and stacks of printed materials lined the table. Jackson entered with a group of 6 officers, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright skepticism. Among them was Officer Grant, the Union representative who had clashed with James during the City Hall meeting. Grant's burly frame and stern expression dominated the room, but James wasn't intimidated. He had faced far more formidable adversaries in his time. Thank you all for coming, James began, his voice steady. I know some of you have concerns about the reforms we're proposing. That's why we're here, to address them openly and honestly. Grant crossed his arms. With all due respect, General, you're asking us to trust a system that's been turned against us. This oversight board, it's nothing more than a way to hang us out to dry. James met his gaze evenly. That's where you're wrong, Officer Grant. The oversight board isn't about punishment. It's about accountability. And accountability protects everyone, including officers who do their jobs with integrity. One of the younger officers, a woman with a tight bun and wary eyes, spoke up. But what about split-second decisions? Are we going to be second-guessed by civilians who don't understand the pressures we face? James nodded, acknowledging her point. That's a valid concern. That's why the Oversight Board will include trained professionals, former officers, legal experts, and community leaders, people who understand the nuances of law enforcement. This isn't about second-guessing. It's about ensuring transparency and fairness. Grant scoffed. And what happens when the media gets hold of every mistake? We'll be crucified. James stepped closer, his tone firm but measured. Mistakes are inevitable. But the public isn't looking for perfection. They're looking for honesty. If we own our mistakes and show a commitment to learning from them, we can rebuild trust. And that trust will make your job easier, not harder. A story to inspire, to drive his point home. James shared a story from his military career. Years ago, during a mission in Afghanistan, one of my units made a critical error. A miscommunication led to an airstrike that hit a civilian area. The fallout was devastating. Lives lost, trust shattered. But instead of covering it up, we faced it head-on. We admitted our mistake, compensated the victims' families, and overhauled our communication protocols. It was painful, but it was necessary. And because we owned our actions, we regained the trust of the local population. The room was silent as James finished, the weight of his words sinking in. This isn't just about avoiding bad press, he continued. It's about doing what's right. If we want the community to stand with us, we have to show them that we're willing to stand for justice, even when it's uncomfortable. Building bridges. After the meeting, some officers lingered to ask questions, their skepticism giving way to cautious optimism. Grant, however, remained unconvinced. General, he said, approaching James as the room emptied, I still think you're asking for too much. But I'll admit, you've got a way of making people listen. James extended his hand. I'm not asking for perfection, Officer Grant. I'm asking for progress, and I hope you'll be part of that progress. Grant hesitated before shaking his hand. We'll see. Facing the Union. The next day, James and Captain Jackson attended a meeting with the police union's leadership. The room was charged with tension, the air thick with mistrust. Union President Thomas Wilkins, a grizzled veteran with a no-nonsense demeanor, wasted no time getting to the point. General Robinson, Wilkins began, "You've stirred up a lot of controversy. Some of my officers feel like they're being thrown under the bus. What do you have to say to them?" James leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I say this, if you're doing your job with integrity, you have nothing to fear. But if you're abusing your power or violating the trust of the people you serve, then yes, you should be held accountable. And I think most of your officers would agree." Wilkins's eyes narrowed. "You're walking a fine line, General." "So does your department," James replied. "The community's trust is eroding. If we don't act now, we risk losing it entirely. These reforms aren't an attack. They're an opportunity to rebuild that trust." For over an hour, James and Jackson fielded questions, countered objections, and made their case. By the end of the meeting, it was clear they hadn't won everyone over, but they had planted seeds of doubt in the staunchest critics. A unified front. That evening, James returned to the Veteran Center, where Sarah and Marcus were waiting with updates from the community. "We've got good news," Sarah said, handing James a tablet. "The petition to support the Oversight Board has over 10,000 signatures. People are rallying behind this." Marcus grinned. "And the town hall next week is already at capacity. Folks are ready to speak out." James smiled, a rare flicker of hope lighting his features. "Good. We're going to need all the support we can get." As the three of them strategized late into the night, James couldn't help but reflect on the journey so far. The road to reform was steep and treacherous, but they were making progress, inch by inch, step by step. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt winnable. And James Robinson was determined to see it through. A turning point. The auditorium of Lincoln High School buzzed with anticipation. The town hall, now in its third iteration, had become a focal point for the entire city. Rows of chairs filled the large space, with every seat occupied and dozens of people standing along the walls. The room was an eclectic mix: concerned citizens, local activists, off-duty officers, city officials, and even a handful of teenagers wearing homemade shirts with slogans like "Justice for All" and "Reform Now." James Robinson stood backstage, adjusting his tie in the dim light. His reflection in the mirror revealed a man who looked as resolute as he felt, though he couldn't ignore the weariness etched in the lines of his face. Over the past weeks, he had poured every ounce of his energy into this movement, meeting with community leaders, navigating bureaucratic roadblocks, and enduring pointed criticisms from detractors. Sarah Chen appeared at his side, holding a clipboard. "The media's already out there," she said, her tone brisk but tinged with nervous excitement. "Channel 6 is doing a live stream, and Marcus is in the front row with some of the younger volunteers." James gave a small nod. "Good. The more people see this, the better." Sarah hesitated, then asked, "Do you think we're ready for this, General?" James turned to her, his gaze steady. "No one's ever truly ready for change, Sarah, but that's why we do it anyway." She smiled faintly, inspired by his unwavering conviction. "They're waiting for you." The weight of the moment. When James stepped onto the stage, the murmurs in the crowd fell silent, replaced by an expectant hush. The spotlight illuminated him, and he took a moment to scan the room. His eyes settled briefly on Marcus, who gave him a thumbs up, and then on Captain Marcus Jackson, seated with a group of officers near the back. Finally, he looked out at the sea of faces, angry, hopeful, skeptical, determined. He began with his characteristic calm. "Good evening. Thank you all for being here. It's a testament to this community's strength that we've come together not once, but multiple times, to confront the challenges we face." He paused, letting his words settle before continuing. "The path we're on isn't easy. Change never is. But it's necessary. Tonight, I want to address three things: where we've come from, where we are now, and where we need to go." James recounted the events that had sparked this movement: the incident in the park, the viral video, and the public outcry that followed. He spoke of the reforms they had proposed, from the creation of a civilian oversight board to new training protocols for officers, and he acknowledged the resistance they had faced. "Some of you are here because you believe in this mission," he said, his voice firm. "Some of you are here because you're skeptical, and some of you are here because you outright oppose it. That's okay. All of you have a place in this conversation. This isn't about silencing voices. It's about amplifying them." The testimony. As James finished his opening remarks, Sarah took the stage, introducing a panel of speakers who had been invited to share their stories. The first was a young man named Jordan, who had been wrongfully arrested as a teenager and still carried the emotional scars. "When I was 15, Jordan began, his voice trembling. "I was walking home from basketball practice when a cop pulled me over. He said I matched the description of a suspect. I spent the night in a holding cell before they realized I had nothing to do with it." The audience murmured in outrage, and James felt a pang of sorrow for the boy who had endured such an injustice. Next was a mother, Maria, whose son had been killed in a police shooting. Her voice cracked as she held up a framed photo of her boy, a bright-eyed teenager with a love for music. "He wasn't perfect," Maria said, tears streaming down her face. "But he didn't deserve to die. And I'll never stop fighting for justice, for him and for every other child who's been taken too soon." The room was silent, the weight of her grief palpable. Then came Officer Rebecca Hart, who had served on the force for over a decade. She spoke of her own struggles within the department, from facing sexism to watching colleagues cover for each other's mistakes. "I joined this job to protect and serve," Rebecca said, her voice strong. "But I've seen too many instances where we failed to live up to that promise. These reforms are a chance to change that, to do better for ourselves and for the community we serve." The clash. As the panel ended, James opened the floor to questions and comments. For a while, the discussion was constructive, with people sharing their perspectives and offering ideas. But then, as expected, the tension in the room boiled over. A man in the audience stood, his face red with anger. "This is all just anti-police propaganda," he shouted. "You're turning officers into scapegoats while letting criminals run wild." The room erupted in a mix of cheers and jeers. James raised his hand for silence. "I understand your frustration," he said, addressing the man directly. "But accountability isn't anti-police. It's pro-justice, and justice is what keeps our society safe, for everyone." The man shook his head but sat down, muttering under his breath. Moments later, another voice rose, this time from an activist in the back. "Words are cheap, General. What guarantees do we have that these reforms will actually change anything?" James's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. "You have my word," he said. "And you have the word of everyone who's committed to this cause. But more importantly, you have power. Hold us accountable. Demand results. Don't let us rest until the change is real." A glimmer of unity. The meeting stretched late into the night, but by the time it ended, something had shifted. The air of division had softened, replaced by a tentative sense of unity. People shook hands, exchanged phone numbers, and signed up to join working groups. Even some of the officers in attendance lingered to speak with community members, their guarded expressions giving way to cautious openness. As the crowd dispersed, Marcus approached James, his face lit with excitement. "Did you see that? People were actually talking to each other, like really talking." James smiled faintly. "That's the first step. Now we have to make sure the momentum doesn't fade." Sarah joined them, holding her phone. "General, you're not going to believe this. The live stream. It had over 50,000 viewers. And the comments. People from all over the country are asking how they can replicate this in their own communities." James felt a surge of hope. The impact of their work was spreading far beyond their city. But with that hope came a sobering realization. The stakes were higher than ever. A quiet reflection. That night, James sat alone in his study, the echoes of the town hall still ringing in his ears. He thought of Maria's tears, Jordan's trembling voice, and Rebecca's quiet determination. He thought of the man who had shouted in anger and the activist who had demanded guarantees. Every voice, every emotion, every perspective was part of the larger tapestry they were trying to weave. He picked up a pen and opened his journal, a habit he had developed during his years in the military. On the blank page, he wrote, "Today, we took another step forward. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The road ahead is long, and the obstacles are many. But as long as there are people willing to fight for what's right, there's hope." Setting the journal aside, James leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace, a brief reprieve in a battle that was far from over. And in that quiet moment, James Robinson felt something he hadn't felt in years, the unshakable belief that change was not only possible, it was inevitable.